Greetings ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's Reddit series video from the subreddit HFY called Clint Stone Ch.12 Lost, written by some guy named Ted. The link to the original will be down below, and as always, I hope that you enjoy, and if you do, please consider subscribing. Clint Stone is not invincible, he is not uncuttable, and he is not invulnerable. He is incredibly tough and hard, but he can be broken. He had learned that his mind could be broken on Baruna, but he had always seemed so strong and solid. I did not think that his body could be. This was a lesson that I learnt all too well in Viziduk. The events of Baruna were a month old, and Clint was traveling the galaxy, righting the wrongs that he could find, in an attempt to make up for the savagery on Baruna. We were flying over Viziduk when we received a distress call. A ship had crashed on Viziduk and they were trapped. Before I had met Clint Stone, and for a time after, I would have just flown on by, ignoring their cries for help. Now, Clint had shown me that you should do all you can for those in need. For those that you do not know, Viziduk is a death world, a place where the very ground tries to kill you. We found the ship wedged into a wall of a canyon, buried deeply into the stone. To make matters worse, the canyon was shaking from the force of the earthquake. The ship would be doomed if we didn't get to them, and we landed at the Susan at the end of the canyon and ran in, dodging the falling rocks. My feet were unsteady on the hard ground, struggling to find a good footing as the shifting ground. A dull rumble filled the air and the ground beneath our feet, and the rock walls reaching into the sky shook with the fury of earth. I followed Clint down to the long passage of stone, dust falling from the air, blurring my sight. Ahead of us was the ship embedded in the wall of the canyon. The impact of that stricken ship had caused this earthen rage, and the walls threatened to topple, burying us alive. Clint ran ahead, seemingly oblivious to the danger. I know he was aware of the risk and was wary of the danger, but he pushed himself onwards. What was their threat of death when there were lives to save? I know how he felt because I felt the same. The ground gave way in a particularly violent shake, and I stumbled, steadying myself on a fallen boulder. The back of my back swung and hit me in the arm, and the various metal objects inside of it all clanked on the impact. I flipped it back on my shoulder and continued on my path to the crashed ship. Had it been 6 months earlier, I would have not run into this canyon. The walls were shaking and on the verge of tumbling down on top of us. I wouldn't have even set foot into this death world after I had seen Clint Stone save countless people at great personal risk, and entering into a raging fire station myself. I found that I could be a hero, that I could save people despite my fears. Clint had shown me that. And so we found ourselves running here, running into certain death, dodging falling boulders many times our size, fighting to save the ship full of beings that we had never met. I had never felt so alive. I'd done things like this a good dozen times since the station, and every time I felt the same, terrified, scared stiff, but alive. The thrill of staring death in the face and escaping unharmed was the best thing that I'd ever experienced. Now I knew why Clint does things he does. The dust grew thicker, my vision grew dimmer. I could still see the outline of the ship, bright and grey silhouetted against the dark tan of the wall. As I watched a large chunk of rock split from the top of the wall and crash down into the canyon, perhaps 100 yards past the ship. Clint shouted something at me, but I couldn't hear him over the rumble of the ground. "What?" I shouted over the sound of the crackling stone. "We need to hurry. I can see the wall starting to crack above the ship," came the reply, loud enough to be heard clearly. We quickened our pace, considerable as it already was. As we approached the ship, the cause of the crash became apparent. The back boosters was wholly blacked out and pitted from the impact of a foreign object. If I had to guess, I would say a meteor. The body of the ship, once smooth and streamlined, was now crumpled and dented from the force of its landing on this planet. A good half of its length was now pushed deep into the stone wall, wedging it tightly. Clint rushed to the side of the ship and searched for a way in, and I did the same, my eyes passing over the hull, looking for anything that could mean a door. I found it a simple outline half hidden by a fallen boulder. I motioned to Clint, but he had seen it before me and was halfway there already. I dashed over, the ground trying to trip me up with a fierce shaking. When I got there, Clint was trying to pry the door open with his hands. As strong as he was, the metal was designed to ward off the immense power of space. It didn't budge, even before the man of stone. Reaching into a pack, I pulled out a plasma cutter, one of the many tools in there, and handed it to him. Clint and I had devised this pack after we got into a situation where we needed a certain tool and we didn't have it. We made do, but we put together this pack to make it much easier in the future. But with tools that we might need in our efforts to save lives. We brought the pack with us wherever we went. He ignited the plasma cutter, the blade overturning of the brilliant blue, and then began to cut the metal skin of the ship. It was slow work as the metal was thick and tough. The ground shook harder, and several boulders crashed onto the ship's roof and rolled off. Clint redoubled his efforts, cutting swiftly through the barrier, trying to reach the people inside. "I've almost got it. When we get in there, you get the people in the back out, and I'll see if there's anyone in the front," he said, grunting with the effort of wielding the cutter on unstable ground. One slip, and he could have sliced off his arm. I nodded in agreement and stood back. I turned around, looking back through the haze at the end of the canyon, plotting the best way to navigate through the maze of fallen boulders and chasms that appeared at the very violent shake. The best way seemed to be... The ground convulsed, sending boulders flying into the air. I was knocked from my feet from the force, and I hit the ground, the breath driven out of my lungs. Beneath me I heard the canyon wall give away and fall with a thundering roar. Rock and dust filled the air as hundreds of tons of canyon wall came crashing down on us. I curled into a ball, arms over my head. I prayed for it to end. It felt like something hit my back, and I was thrown half a dozen feet to the side. My vision flickered, and I remained conscious. I saw a large boulder beside me, and I pulled myself behind it, seeking whatever shelter I could find. Squeezing my eyes shut, waiting for death, for the avalanche to end. The ground shook, and the sky fell for another half a minute, and then slowed. The noise quieted and the rocks settled. The ground still shook, but with a far less anger. I opened my eyes and saw the rocks strewn across the canyon floor, spilling hundreds of feet in every direction. I forced myself to my feet, using the boulder behind me for support, back aching from whatever had hit me. I coughed hoarsely, rubbing my eyes to clear out the dust. I stiffened when I finally realized what had happened. The canyon wall had collapsed on top of us, and it had been for that large boulder I sheltered behind, I would have likely been killed. The ship was likely buried under several tons of fallen rock and stone. I spun, my eyes taking in the disaster behind me. The ship lay crushed under the weight of tons of rock and stone, the hull torn and flattened. There was no way that anyone in there survived. I could see no sign of Clint. I dove into the pile of the boulders, and I shouted his name, frantically searching for him. I scrambled over the debris in front of me, my eyes searching for any signs as I moved to where I had last seen him. I slid over the last boulder by the door, and my foot landed on something with more give than hard rock. I had found him. He lay under a pile of small rocks. Miraculously, none of the large ones had landed on him, though they were scattered around him. His eyes were closed, and he wasn't moving. I knelt beside him and cleared off the debris burying him. As my hand passed over his chest, I felt wetness. I lifted my hand and saw red blood in the tips of my fingers. I hurriedly cleared off the rest and tore open Clint's shirt, searching for the source of blood. My eyes settled on a thin shard of rock forced into his chest, just above the left of his sternum. I placed my fingers on his throat, and I could tell that he'd a pulse. Clint was alive, but from the looks of that wound, it wasn't going to be for much longer. I had to get him out, but back to Susan, and to the hospital. I slipped my arm under his body and heaved. I lifted him several inches above the ground, but I couldn't get him no higher. I should have been able to get him higher. I carried him before, and, while his weight was considerable, I managed. Something was preventing me from lifting him. Glanced around, and what I saw was grim. Clint's left arm lay stretched out from his body, and, as I followed it with my eyes, disappeared under a massive boulder. From halfway past his elbow, his arm was trapped under an immovable stone twice my height. There was no way that I was going to move that, and if I didn't, Clint would die. I threw myself against the boulder, feet scrabbling for a perch, legs screaming. I pushed with all of my strength, and then more. I pushed with all the power available to my body, and then took more from it. It wasn't enough. The boulder didn't budge, not even an inch. My foot slipped and I fell. I lay there for a moment. I had failed. The boulder still sat there, trapping Clint. I had failed. Clint would die of his wounds because I couldn't free him. I had failed. No, I refused to believe that. Clint would not have given up. He would have pushed that boulder until it flew into orbit. He would have smashed it to pieces and freed whoever was trapped. I pushed myself up to my hands and knees. I would free him, whatever it took. But I was not half as strong as Clint. There was nothing that I could do to the boulder, and that would not stop me trying. I would fight until the last, never giving in. And as I forced myself to my feet, my hand brushed against metal. I looked down and I saw the plasma cutter, miraculously untouched by the falling glyph. I looked at it and I knew what I had to do. I ignited the blade and a blue glow looked wicked in my eyes. I knelt next to Clint. "Forgive me for this," I said to him. I raised the blade high and brought it down on his arm, just below the elbow. The blade, designed to cut through hardened metal, cut effortlessly through the flesh, tugging a little on his bones, and continued through. The smell of the flesh filled the air and smoke wafted up from his stump. The head of the blade had cauterized the wound, ensuring that it would not bleed. It was a clean cut, separating Clint's trapped arm from the rest of his body. I had crippled Clint Stone. I knew it was to save his life, but I had taken his hand. He would be less now, and I had done it to him. But there was no time for thought. I felt near the edge of tears, but I could not cry now. I had work to do. I gathered Clint in my arms and heaved myself up to my feet, his dead weight pulling me down as I struggled, nearly falling, but I managed to not fail Clint Stone, the man who had saved so many lives, the man who'd rescued so many innocents. I forced myself forward, making my way to the end of the canyon, fighting the ripping ground, fighting my exhaustion. I pressed onwards. I forced myself to go faster and faster. Every moment I counted, and I would not fail. The ground rumbled, and my legs nearly gave way. By sheer force of will, I managed to stay upright. I trod onward, growing ever closer to my goal. Susan loomed out in the dust, and I gasped a sigh of relief. Carrying Clint Stone through that canyon of shuddering rock was the hardest thing that I had ever done in my life. I stumbled up the ramp and pushed myself further, to the edge of the bay. I laid Clint on the ground and stepped him down. I staggered into the cabin, and I started Susan. When the engine started to hum, I pushed the throttle down, and I took off into the sky. I pushed the throttle as far as would go, something Clint had never done before. He said that he wanted to save it for a special occasion, but now I needed all the speed I could get. Susan shot forward, moving at an unbelievable speed. The planet's surface fell away behind us, and Susan flew into space. As soon as we cleared the planet's gravity well, I pushed the ship into warp. The stars elongated and narrowed before my eyes, and Susan jumped between dimensions. The space in front of her turned blue and black, swirling in a tunnel. I set the course for the nearest Universal Hospital and forced the throttle to max. Clint was losing blood by the minute, and I could do nothing. I wasn't a medic, and I had no knowledge of such things. All I could do was pray and get him to help as fast as possible. Susan shot through warp at speeds never before seen. She broke every record in the book as I coaxed every ounce of power that she had. We should have still been in a gravity well, but instead we were nearly halfway to our destination. I hoped that it would be enough. Susan pushed onward, engines strained to the limit. The hospital was fast approaching, and I only hoped that it was fast enough. We exited warp, and I sped into the hangar, Susan blowing several smaller vehicles over with the speed of her passage. I slammed on the brakes and threw myself out of the seat and down into the bay. I opened the doors, and 2 medical officials rushed inside, drawn by the disruption caused by Susan's passing. They took one look at Clint and dragged him out of the bay, stretched him out on a gurney, and rushed him into the operating room. I tried to follow, but my body and mind had been through too much in too short of a time. I felt my body slowly collapse, and when I hit the ground, I felt like a soft feather pillow. My eyes slid shut and I slipped into unconsciousness. End of chapter. I hope that you enjoyed. If you'd like to support the channel or the author, all the stuff is down below. And as always, I hope that you guys have a good one, and I'll see you in the next story. Cheers.